This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. This week, I'm joined by Luke Coleman, founder of Luke Coleman Gardens, an Edinburgh-based studio known for bold, climate-resilient gardens, rooted in story, ecology and craft. Luke was named RHS Designer of the Year 2025, winning Gold, Best Construction and People's Choice at the Wentworth show. His work draws on landscapes from the Scottish Highlands to the Cape Floral Kingdom, exploring how gardens can tell stories of resilience and culture. We talk about his design principles, what resilience means in a garden, and how gardens might bring cultures together.
So obviously I'm Luke, owner-director of Luke Coleman Gardens, but I've been in horticulture, gardening since 2017 actually, when I sort of started my own soft landscaping company in Surrey, where I grew up. And a lot of that was helping garden designers install gardens. So it was always the soft landscaping, not the hard, but helping install gardens for development homes and also some private gardens. And then subsequently taking on the maintenance of those projects as well. So that was sort of really informative to kind of see, the highs and lows of those projects. So sort of going in and transforming spaces, bare spaces, and helping the designers obviously realize the plans, but then also kind of seeing how they develop over time and sort of change with the seasons and sort of sometimes the positives and then also some of the negatives with things that were happening. So yeah, it was informative. And I kind of did that for almost 4 years until 2021. And I was enjoying what I was doing. I loved gardening, obviously loved horticulture and plants and everything, was always super engaged with that and felt connected to it, but wanted to learn a bit more, sort of hit a bit of a wall with the solely sort of installation maintenance side of things. There was actually a friend of mine at the time who was also a gardener. He sort of got in touch and said, I found out about this garden design course at the Eden Project. I'm going to go there and study. I think you should join. And it was all very last minute. I think it was about 2 weeks before the course actually started. The applications had closed, but I sort of emailed the tutor there, Matt James, and said, I know it's last minute, but would I be able to join for your design course? He offered me a quick phone interview. And then 2 weeks later, I'd moved up to Cornwall. And I was then studying garden design at the Eden Project, which was a super inspiring place to sort of further my education and dive deeper into, I suppose, design with sort of already having that practical grounding and understanding of gardens from my previous experience.
And then is design what you do mostly nowadays?
What the business offers is full garden design from sort of concept to completion, but then also offering sort of the sourcing and installation of plants, and then with big emphasis on sort of the aftercare of those gardens. So at the moment, I look after the gardens that I've sort of installed and designed because there's only a handful of them, but sort of in the future and going forward, hopefully, as I get more designs and there's more projects, I'll be able to sort of employ gardeners or at least specify gardeners to look after the projects, but it'll be part of the service that we offer.
I think it's such an important part of the design process is to have that understanding of how gardens establish and how they develop over time. So I think that's a real sort of key string to your bow. And if you've got a certain set of principles that underline your business?
I mean, I think hopefully all new gardeners, garden designers, sort of my generation, I think it's a kind of no-brainer that we need to be thinking sustainability wise and thinking about resilience and sort of thinking about the impact of every decision we make in design. So, the impact of every material we choose and every plant that we put in the ground. So my design will always respond to initially the conditions of the site. So we'll always try and work with those conditions and, then plan and plant accordingly based on the ecology and the habitats of that site. So obviously the site survey is really important to inform that.
Well, listening to you speak there, what came out for me was you said sustainability and resilience. And yes, you're right. I think that many designers you'd like to think are on board with the whole sustainability issue. However, resilience, I think, is a slightly maybe newer term. I wondered if you could explain what resilience means to you in gardens.
So for me, resilience in gardens is about creating systems, so designing systems and plant communities that can adapt and endure. So it's designing landscapes that respond to climate extremes, so floods, droughts, hotter and drier summers, but without needing sort of constant input. So that might mean using green roofs, rain gardens, or retention ponds that hold water in the landscape, and choosing tougher climate adapted plants that can, survive with little irrigation equally as water becomes more of a precious resource. Which is kind of why I've become fascinated by sand planting, is for that reason. If you specify the right type of sand, it drains quickly, yet it holds just enough moisture for the right plants to thrive. So they have to work a bit harder at first to develop deeper roots and access that moisture, but that effort builds longer term strength. Yeah, so resilience for me is about creating gardens that work with the realities of climate change, spaces that can weather extremes, sustain biodiversity, and not sacrifice the joy and aesthetic that gardens should bring year after year.
You mentioned, obviously, gardens that are resilient can cope with extremes, and it is very tricky to know what we're going to be facing. Can resilient gardens do the job, bearing in mind that we really don't know what's going to be thrown at us?
Yeah, I suppose it means just looking even deeper into your garden space, landscape, and observing for a little bit longer before designing and before implementing things, to sort of work out where, the wetter areas might be, where the drier areas might be, so that you can put those systems in place to cope with that. And again, it's about having that sort of baseline expectation of things changing year on year, I suppose. And if it's a wetter summer, then a certain area of the garden is going to be performing a lot better than on a hotter, drier summer, where a different area is going to perhaps perform better. But yeah, designing systems and putting things in place that gives it the best chance. And if there's not necessarily wetter areas of the garden, that's where the designer's role comes in, to kind of mold the landscape to create dips and mounds and things, and create drier areas. And they can be artificial to begin with, I suppose.
I saw a post on Instagram the other day, and I think they've got a nursery, in fact, and they're putting in sand beds. And somebody said, well, how are you squaring that away? Because sand is a kind of finite resource. So if somebody had that question about, well, if we're growing in sand, is that sustainable? What would you say to that?
Firstly, it would be, ideal to use recycled sand. So sand that's already been quarried and has already had a previous life, and therefore is just being recycled and reused in the first instance. So I think that is sustainable. And I think it's no less sustainable than using soil or compost, because obviously that has to be dug up and bagged up and transported from somewhere. So there's always going to be a kind of a negative sort of offset to bringing in any material to a site. But it's sort of about our role as designers to sort of make the best judgment or give the best advice on what's most appropriate in the long run, basically. So, for example, I will always try and work with the soil and with the conditions of the garden, so not bring anything in the first instance. But if I had to improve the soil or improve the site, so for example, if it's a super compacted heavy clay and it just needs something done to it in order for plants to grow and to establish a healthier ecosystem, then I would opt for sand in the first instance, because I think from, the plantings that I've studied and the communities that grow in there, and from seeing what happens when you put bare root plants into sand, I think in the long run, over time, what you're putting in is going to offset the negative carbon impact, I suppose, of bringing that substrate in.
I suppose part of me thinks, rather than trying to completely change a site, if it is compacted clay, why are we not researching perennials that could thrive in that kind of situation and then sow them from seed? I guess we're always looking for ways to reduce our impact, and it is an evolving thing. The more we learn, the more we trial, the more we can make better informed decisions in terms of sustainability. But I wanted to also go back to the resilience thing, because you sent me a message, it was food for thought. You said that resilience actually goes beyond the plants and it encompasses people and place. And I wanted you to expand on that a little bit, if you could, because I think that's a really fascinating concept.
Yeah, so for me, it's been quite evident from a young age the impact that gardening and being exposed to nature has on the sort of human experience, and sort of from a sort of therapeutic kind of well-being point of view. It's definitely a mission of mine to and get more people sort of back involved and engaged with gardening. So from a public point of view, providing spaces that people can go and nurture and connect with and engage is important.
Another word that you mentioned was legacy, which again, I thought, wow, yeah, that's a very good point. When you're designing a space or working in a space, are you thinking beyond the lifespan of when you might be involved with the garden? Are you thinking about how it could evolve, what significance it can hold for people? And I guess this is more a question about public spaces, but not necessarily. I mean, private gardens, when you think about the input that goes into them when they're established, especially if it's a big design, how long is that going to last? And what is the actual meaning behind it? Am I just putting together a collection of plants that work, right plant, right place, and a co-evolving plant community? Or am I actually thinking about there's a narrative behind this garden and there's a message here and I want that to continue?
I agree. And I think the message beyond the sort of initial impact and aesthetic artistically of the designer's vision and of that sort of planting plan design coming to life, I think for me, what's more powerful is the impact it has on people and community and those who engage and use spaces and gardens or landscapes. And I guess having worked in a lot of gardens, I suppose when I first started out and, some of the maintenance contracts and things that I was doing, some of these super expensive multi-million pound houses with big gardens and things, but nobody ever used them. And it didn't kind of matter how much money got spent on these gardens and how much money got spent on the landscaping and the maintenance, these places just naturally felt completely soulless because there was nobody there and they weren't used. And for me, the nicest gardens and the nicest landscapes are the ones that are open and they're the ones that are accessible and are the ones that people come to meet at and come to garden at and come to play music at and come to have conversation at, much in the same way you would with a local community centre or down the local pub. I think for me, horticulture and gardening has that same potential, which maybe sometimes is slightly overlooked.
That is such a good point. I was just thinking then about a garden where I used to work, and the wage bill was, back in the day, it was about £6,000 a month. And we used to come down sort of occasional weekends, but would never let anyone else in the garden to see it, wouldn't open it, wouldn't let the media in. And I get all that because it's privacy, but it was this huge garden, very, very manicured, very beautiful, but completely lacking in people. And it was just weird. And actually, they do open it now and they have shared it a lot more with the world. And I think that's great to see, because otherwise, like you say, it's kind of, you've built this beautiful space, but if no one's seeing it, it's just kind of almost a little bit pointless to kind of have that garden that you don't ever share with anyone because you want to keep it all to yourself. And, it's your thing, but no one else is going to get access to it.
Yeah, and then when you're paying the gardener, I suppose for those gardens I'm talking about, a lot of that would have been better if they didn't have a gardener, because a lot of the gardening, it was at the detriment to the wildlife because it was a lot of pointless things like leaf blowing and tidying and cutting big lawns and things and stuff that wasn't beneficial to anyone or anything really.
You mentioned culture as well, sort of bringing together of cultures. And I don't want to impose too much on gardens in terms of a responsibility for easing society's ills. But, is it a place where you can bring cultures together, do you think?
Definitely, yeah. Gardening's a universal language, and sort of whether you're an experienced trained gardener, designer, horticulturalist, or whether you're someone who just likes pretty flowers and the sound of water, I think sort of that emotion and feeling that it gives to be in a good quality green space, natural space, just makes people feel good, and then in turn sparks conversation and makes people feel comfortable. But then equally, good design and good gardens will also have little pockets and little places where you can go and be alone. I think that's equally as important, to find little places and moments of stillness, for whatever reason.
Yeah, that's a very good point as well. So you said earlier about the aesthetic of gardens, and you are now an multi-award winning horticulturist. And thinking about the aesthetic, I think sometimes you do get rewarded for how your gardens look aesthetically. And that's because that is easy to quantify. You take a picture of a space, it looks beautiful, but how do you quantify the user experience, or how do you quantify the kind of wildlife content of a garden, of a space? Do we maybe need to rethink how we reward people for their endeavours, for their results in a gardening capacity, because actually a lot of the things that are being rewarded is, as I say, purely the aesthetic. It doesn't go much deeper than that into the kind of narrative, into the garden users, into all the other things that make a garden a really vibrant space.
Being completely honest, I do struggle with a lot of that sometimes. As I said, I think maybe it's because of my background and understanding truly how gardens are all through the season and all through the year, and then seeing sometimes pictures online, and especially with Instagram and things, that real sort of Instagram versus reality, smoke and mirrors type thing is difficult. But then I understand, and I'm also guilty of having to need to sell a product and to sell a service and to pay bills at the end of the day. In a way, it's necessary, but it would be nice if there was awards given for more than just glossy images and pictures and, I suppose, more meaningful things. But I guess it's harder to quantify. People are trying, but harder to quantify the real effects on biodiversity and people's mental health and things. And I suppose you could study and you could ask people to do more surveys and things. And I suppose we could employ more ecologists and get more biodiversity studies done at the start of projects, sort of more baseline, so we have more of a baseline to work off, so that you can kind of give awards for landscapes and schemes over a period of time. But again, from my experience, it's like gardens, once they've been designed, and planting plans especially, they have an expiry date, for want of a better word. Like, they're always going to, even with a gardener, they're always going to evolve to a point where they either get left as is, or they need redesigning again, or certainly a large amount of input in terms of to revamp the scheme and to give them sort of more diversity and interest again.
Yeah, totally agree with what you said there, actually. And I was thinking as well about the things that inspire you, because I get the sense you're not just about the aesthetic. You are obviously very, very into your plants. I think you're a very thoughtful designer. And I wondered if you could tell us a bit about the sort of things that inspire you, whether that's landscapes or people.
Definitely landscapes, of course. Like, I spend most of my free time, traveling and in wild landscapes, and that's where I'm sort of at my happiest, when I'm hiking and walking and just sort of in awe of nature as is. And again, that's why sometimes it's difficult when you're designing and trying to create these spaces that almost mimic natural processes and natural habitats, but knowing truthfully that I'll never be able to achieve something, as beautiful or perfect as a natural habitat in its moment. But that's not to say that what we're doing is wrong. What inspires me is sort of, I suppose, that meeting of natural landscapes and art, I suppose, and the human ability to incorporate art and tell stories via the medium of nature and sculpture, I think, is where it becomes quite interesting. So yeah, that's definitely for me the most inspiring kind of designs and landscapes, are sort of, that fusion of nature, but then also that kind of human touch, which is telling a story of the place or a specific narrative, which I guess is why I was kind of drawn to show gardens and why I am interested in show gardens. Again, a bit of a love-hate thing, but I do genuinely believe that they serve a good purpose for the industry. And I like that, that artistic ability to use plants and to use landscape materials and to use sculptures to tell a story and to engage people, I think, is what inspires me the most.
And do you think that there sometimes is too much emphasis on mimicking the wild look or achieving that wild aesthetic, perhaps to the detriment of maybe including more designed elements or paying attention more to the actual human side of a design?
I do think so, yeah. And to be honest, they're not my favorite gardens where it's, trying too much to be a replica of the wild or of a specific habitat. I think it's important from a planting point of view to consider that, to make sure that you're putting, the right plants in the right place. But as I said, I think the most interesting ones for me is where there's very designed, human designed elements that sort of create that contrast or create that moment of thought, be it through shape or material.
Yeah, and is there any designer at the moment or any horticulturist who's really inspiring you, or someone you've come across where you thought, yes, they're doing something that either I really like or something that's really different, thought provoking, something like that?
Well, I went to an Andy Goldsworthy exhibition in Edinburgh a few weeks ago, and obviously he does a lot of sort of like ephemeral sculptures, essentially. So using sort of like natural materials in the wild, basically, and then creating sculptures out of them and photographing it, but very intentionally. The point is they're only intended to be there for a short period of time, and then they'll either, melt if they're a nice sculpture, or they'll rot if it's made of wood, or blow away if they're, made of leaves. And there was something about that I just really liked. And I thought that is, very relevant to kind of a lot of the discussion about, providing habitat and things in our gardens and in our designs, thinking about not just providing the food source, but how do we provide habitats? And I thought that kind of ephemeral sculpture could tie into that quite nicely. And an interesting way for us as designers and gardeners to maybe collaborate more with artists and reintroduce certain types of sculptures, but sculptures as habitats, not just as things to look at. Because I think sculptures have kind of become, in my opinion, a bit uncool. Some sculptures that you see in garden designs, they're just a bit clinical and uninteresting. If we collaborated with the right artists and designers or artists themselves, and enabled and commissioned people to build things that weren't intended to last forever, much like the planting schemes and things. I think that could be quite interesting and inspiring to see what shape or form that takes.
I couldn't agree more. And I mean, I'm not putting words into your mouth here. This is entirely my opinion. But when I walk around the Chelsea Flower Show and I look at some of the sculpture on offer there, quite honestly, it's just tap. And I think, is this the best that we can achieve for our gardens? Again, my opinion, somebody probably loves them, but they're the same old things year in, year out. And you just think, have we not got anything new that we can go to? Because gardens can be this amazing area of creative expression. And I like the fact that you've taken all the good elements of the sustainability and the plant communities and all the rest of that, but then are still managing to bring in the artistic side, and you're not shying away from that. You're going, actually, let's do this kind of melding of the two disciplines and come up with this amazing garden going forward. But I just think there's such an opportunity there. Going forward, what have you got planned? Have you got any good projects that you're excited about, or is there anything like a dream project that you would really like to get your teeth into?
So I'm very fortunate that the show garden that I designed, Dracart's Drift, is being relocated to a public park here in Edinburgh, Victoria Park, which I'm super excited about. And I'm just in the process of redesigning that, including much of the elements that were there, but due to obviously the nature of show gardens being so densely planted, I can sort of stretch it over a slightly larger space. And it's sort of going to be a flexible community gathering space on a disused bowling green as sort of part of a wider development project with Earth in Common, who are redeveloping the building as a cafe restaurant. And then they'll be doing lots of sort of food growing. And it's just a really exciting community project to be a part of, and to be able to offer this garden, as part of it. I'm really excited about, and we've done lots of community engagement, and people are really excited to see this sort of award-winning garden space coming to their community. So we'll be running sort of workshops and engaging as many people in the community as possible in sort of the establishment and the sort of future care of this garden.
Thanks to Luke for sharing his views on horticulture and design, and thanks to you for listening. If you like this episode, you might also like episode 305, Building on Nature, and episode 222, Nature from the Rubble. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.